Welcome, folkological folks. I just made up that word, folk and mythological. Do you see what I did there? Okay, welcome to Fabric of Folklore, the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore to really get at the heart of it. I am your host, Vanessa White Rogers, and in this podcast, we really love history, culture, and the details that paint a more rich picture of this life that we're living, the life that our fellow humans are living elsewhere and experiencing different folklore. And within this podcast, we are hoping to help to become more self-aware so that we understand ourselves better and understand other people better so that we become more compassionate and just better human beings all around. So if that sounds like a really great podcast to you, please hit that subscribe button. Hit that button. All right, thanks so much. And today we're going to be having a fantastic show all about African mythology. And as it's the month of May, here in the U.S. at least, we have Mother's Day during this month. And we're going to be talking about some women and mothers of Africa as well as the importance and meaning behind fabrics in different communities, African communities, in part to tie in with the name of our podcast, Fabric of Folklore, which I think is a really cool idea. And we have a fabulously talented guest, Helen Nde, and she is Atlanta-based Cameroonian-born writer, a musician as well, and artist, and she is the curator of the site and project, and now a new podcast of Mythological Africans. And she also provides research and reference services for African mythology, folklore, and broader culture. And she recently published a book called The Runaway Princess and Other Stories, and it's about the deeds and misdeeds and memorable women from African history, legend, and folklore. So thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Vanessa. Thank you for having me on the show.
So I love to know our guest story. I think it helps to inform, where their head's at and how they got to where they are today. And so I have a two-part question for you. The first one is going to be your physical journey. You are Cameroonian born, but live in Atlanta. So I want to talk about how you came to live in the United States, but then we'll also talk about your journey as the curator of the Mythological Africans.
All right, sure. So my my physical journey to the US, I think it's pretty unremarkable. 2008, 2009 feels like a lifetime ago now, but I was able to come to the US as part of the State Department Diversity Visa Program. So it's one of those things where you file the paperwork, and if you get selected, you get selected. And so I found myself in a new country, starting a new life, which was terrifying in many ways.
Yeah.
But how you do as a human being, you rise to the occasion. And I would say it has been an interesting journey so far. So far, so good.
Did you choose Atlanta, or was that chosen for you?
Oh no! Oh my goodness, no. So I've moved around quite a bit in the US actually. So when I first got here, I lived in Maryland.
Okay.
And then I spent some time in Arizona, and went to Illinois, and then Colorado,
Oh my.
and then Georgia, Atlanta. So I've been around quite a bit, just getting the different states of what the US is like. And I will say it feels like a completely different country in many ways from the different locations, just geographically, of course, climate and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been quite the experience just getting to know this country like that.
Are there Cameroonian communities at all in the US? Are there places where
Oh, yeah. So Maryland, I believe, is the hub. Maryland, I think, is where you would find the most Cameroonians.
Where in Maryland? I lived there for a little bit.
Silver Spring, I think, is where a lot of Cameroonians, at least last I remembered, is where the bulk of the Cameroonian community in Maryland lives. But there are big hubs in, I believe, Texas as well.
Okay.
And I would say in most of the major cities, you'll find pockets of people. But I think as it stands, as far as I know, Maryland is still the biggest hub for Cameroonians.
And how about in Atlanta, where you are now? Is there a pretty big community?
Um, I honestly I don't know. I have folks that I spend time
Hmm.
with, and I know that there are other people because when there is a party, for example, people will come together. But in Atlanta, I have the people I spend time with, and that's about it, actually.
So, okay, so when you got to the US, what was one of the things that was a culture shock? What it was something that you were expecting that you wasn't there, and what was something that was there that you weren't expecting?
That is an interesting question. I'm trying to think. Well, I don't know that I would call it culture
Mm.
shock per se, because I was fairly immersed in it before I left. But I definitely enjoyed the easier access to the internet. Being someone who is just thirsty for knowledge and new experiences,
Mm-hmm.
having better access to the internet, certainly, feel that in many ways. And I honestly, I think being someone who is comfortable being in new places and exploring new information has made creating mythological Africans easy for me.
Yeah.
But with having easier access to books, to
Mm.
resources, to music, to other perspectives, that definitely made a big impression on me. Um, but otherwise, I'm trying to think if there was something that was like a culture shock to me. I
You
can't
can't
think
think of
about it. I mean,
anything.
certainly living with people from all over the world, all in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
That was a nice, in a good way. I'm trying to think if there was anything that was just, goodness, what is this? And I would say nothing
Well,
stands
let me flip the question then.
out.
Was there anything that when you got to the US that you didn't know was a part of your culture that started to stand out? So for me, I'll give you an example. I traveled to Costa Rica um, after for an internship, and one of the things that was pointed out to me multiple times was that Americans slam car doors. I never thought about it. I just get out of the car and then I just shut it, and it was disturbing to them. They didn't like that. They more softly closed doors, and that was they said it was a very American trait that I would never have thought
Now
of.
that you mentioned cars, if there was one thing that was culture shock and what in the whirlpool
Uh-huh.
was just how little care some Americans give to their cars. So back home, my dad was a stickler. His car got washed every morning. It was clean,
Oh
clean
my
before
gosh.
outside and in. And that is not the case here. I got in a few cars from classmates and friends. And was like, okay, this is different. But I wish I could say now that I have my own car, I'm as much of a stickler for keeping it, well ordered as my dad was. But he was a stickler, and I imagine he still doesn't drive much these days. But I think he's very deliberate about keeping his car ship shape. So that was, yeah. If I can think of any culture shock type thing, it was just like, man, you really do everything in your car, don't you?
Yeah, and so he's never allowed to see my car because my car, I'm a mom of
Oh my
three,
gosh.
and there's it's not a nice scene.
Oh my god. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about your, I guess, metaphorical journey into how you got into what you're doing today as a writer and the curator of Mythological Africans. How did that journey start?
I think of that journey as an outcome of being an immigrant because there is a way in which being in another country among another people forces you to look at yourself through their eyes
Hmm.
and assess what they see and reconcile that to who you believe yourself to be. And what I found was that there were some questions I couldn't answer about, myself, my history, my ideas about the world. And being someone who is very curious, who is reflective, and likes to think about life and how I fit into the larger puzzle of things, I found that my education in the ways of the world and my understanding of who I am as a person didn't have as much of African culture as I would have preferred. And I am not alone in that. It's an artifact of being raised in a country that is an ex-colony. The dominant culture has a way of sticking its hands in everything, and that showed up in the education we received. History, culture. I
So I don't know
grew up
what
away.
I'm ignorant to this. Was it a colony of France or
France and Britain.
okay.
So Cameroon's history, it was first a German colony, and then after World War One, when Germany was defeated, France and Britain took over. So the country is this weird reverse of Canada. Whereas in Canada, you have the small French-speaking
Yeah.
province, and the rest of the country is English-speaking. Cameroon is the reverse of that. There's a small English-speaking minority, and the majority is French-speaking, and the culture really permeates. So French, the French way of education, judicial system, and all of that permeates the francophone sections, and the English, the British system permeates the anglophone section, and that reflected in what education we receive. And as I was saying, I grew up in a town different from the village where my people are from, so that I didn't grow up immersed in my culture the way some other people are fortunate to have been.
Mm.
And so being out of the country in that way really, really highlighted that for me and made me want to understand, also just being a storyteller and someone who likes stories and read quite a bit,
Hmm.
um, I I found myself with so many questions about what is this? How do I make sense of being alive in this day and age, being a woman, being a black person? And so it drove me in that direction of wanting to explore culture. What happened before this colonial mess? Who were the people? What did they believe? How did they see life? What were their dreams and aspirations? And I would say that's what led to the creation of Mythological Africans. I was initially going to name it Alternative Africans because it was a way of saying, okay, there's another idea, there's another way of being African that's not, this stereotype that people have in their minds of what it means to be African.
Hmm.
And but then I decided against that because it seemed like it just didn't fit right. But I went in the mythological African direction because first it's mythology and folklore, but also I always think about it as a cheeky way to poke at this idea that okay, you have the Africans of your imagination, the mythological Africans, and then you have the real Africans who are just people from different countries and vastly different
Hmm.
cultures trying to be in the world the way everybody else is.
Hmm.
So yeah.
So you said that you enjoy storytelling and you are a storyteller. Did you grow up in a storytelling family?
I would say yes. So my mom writes poetry and fiction,
Oh wow.
and she also English literature and English language for over 30 years. So I grew
Mm.
up in a storytelling culture. I grew up reading. I grew up, living fantasies in my head. And I grew up reading my mom's work. So I would definitely say yes, I grew up a storyteller or I grew up around
And
storytelling.
did she pull from Cameroonian folklore, or did she just make up stories in her head?
So she, from the stories of her that I read and the conversations I've had with her, she's more a contemporary Cameroonian writer, so writing, reflecting the realities of the world around her. Now, sometimes that will intersect with culture and traditional beliefs, but to my memory, and she has works that I haven't even seen because I left the country over 10 years
Uh-huh.
ago. But to my knowledge, she doesn't do the heavy emphasis on mythology and folklore like I do, for example.
Hmm. Okay, and you really like the mythology and the folklore because it helps to inform people of their culture, or what drew you to that?
Well, the main thing was, for example, you live in the West, um, the stars, astrology, all borrow from Greek mythology
Hmm.
and Roman mythology. The metaphors, the idioms, it's so through with mythology and folklore from Europe, from the Americas, from Asia, from all across the world. And to me, I kept thinking, African mythology and folklore that I know has something to offer.
Mm.
And if I know anything about African people, there is just so much out there that hasn't been touched.
Yeah.
And that was a spot on hunch. So the interest in mythology and folklore is because when you start looking at the discussions about the African continent and African people, there tends to be this focus on European arrival and what proceeded after, as that is the history of the African people. But that is not true.
Mm.
That is just absolutely not true. And the way I saw it, the myths and the folklore, the old stories, was the best way to really get a better understanding of who people are and what their aspirations are and who people could be. Because these stories tend to encode values and things like that. So it was kind of a roundabout way for me to get a glimpse at African people and just see what was up before this story got layered on top of it and woven into it in a way of speaking to stay on topic with the theme for the podcast. Because if you think about it as a piece of cloth, you had the different patterns that were emerging from different societies and cultures and contact with the world. But then European arrival and what came from that. I mean, and I say European arrival not to imply that there hadn't been contracts and contact between African peoples and the rest of the world before
Hmm.
the 1500s
Right.
when things started. But there is a mindset that came with that era, which flowed into the slave trade, which flowed into colonization, and that was a new pattern that was woven into the fabric of the African story with such devastating consequences. So it was a way of like unraveling and saying, okay, what happened here and what was going on before
Hmm.
this new pattern got woven? What new pattern can emerge from all of this?
Was there anyone, so in European tradition, I guess the Grimm brothers were from Germany, I believe, but they went around and they basically collected stories from in all the neighboring villages and packaged it into their book. Was there an equivalent to that in Africa?
Um, so African cultures, African peoples have always had a strong storytelling tradition. We had minstrels and bards and people, the equivalent of that. People who, would travel with stories. You had griots who were associated, usually tended to be associated with noble houses, royal families. And you had people who, traders, hunters, um, migrating communities who would carry their stories with them. So stories have always been, part of the
Yeah.
culture. Now, in terms of collecting, the way the Grimm's brothers did, it usually were the European missionaries and eventually anthropologists and ethnographers who were trying to figure the people out, get an understanding of the
Hmm.
people, and missionaries to convert them, for the ethnographers and anthropologists to understand them and give the colonial administrators something to work with. So that tradition of collecting stories, the way the Grimm's brothers did,
Hmm.
came with the missionaries and the administrators, the colonial administration.
Okay. Um, and so, but you can't think it, but there's not a specific book that you can point to that is similar to like the Grimm brothers memoir. What was it?
And there are collections of African folktales. There are quite a few
Oh,
actually
okay.
that are out there, but to my knowledge, the ones that were done by people from the African continent came, within the last 20 or so
Hmm.
years. Anything before that tended to be the work of, American or European folklorists, so anthropologists, ethnographers, and things like that.
Okay. Okay. And so you don't just do the curating of mythological Africans. You're also a writer. You wrote a book, and you also do music. I found your music Spotify page. Do you talk a little bit about your other projects that you work on independently? And I guess it's all kind of tied together. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about what all you are working on.
Got it. Well, the the music thing was an experimental phase.
Okay.
It, like the soundtrack for the Mythological Africans, a theme. It's something I composed myself.
Uh-huh.
But it really was just me playing around with apps on my phone. And I go through phases where if I'm not, caught up in words and writing, then I'm trying to smear colors on paper, like you can see the art in the
Uh-huh.
background. So it's just a way to get stuff out of my head and out of my body. So the music is one part of my creative cycle that I will go through. So sometimes I'm writing, and sometimes I'm cobbling sounds together, sometimes I'm cobbling colors
Uh-huh.
together, and sometimes I'm dancing, and to various degrees of success and
Mm-hmm.
seriousness. I'd say the writing is the most public facing side of all of that. But the music is out there if anyone wants to check it out.
Well,
Aside from the mythological Africans
I
theme,
listened to a couple songs and I thought that they were great. So,
thank you.
yeah, I mean, even if it was, not a very serious hobby, it seemed like you had talent in it. Um,
Thank you.
one of the on your biography on your page, you wrote, "I love to be in nature, pondering complicated things, and figuring out the color, taste, smells, and textures of words." And I just love that. I loved that sentence, and that's how you described yourself. Because personally, I gravitate towards people who like to ponder complicated things because I like to have deep conversations. So, do you want to talk a little bit more about that sentence, about how that's your personality, or I don't know. I found that a very compelling statement.
I mean, life is the simplest and most complicated thing, isn't it? When you really think about it, because it's simple because you're here, you're now, and this is it from moment to moment. This is it.
Mm-hmm.
This really is it. But then it is the most complicated thing because what in the world are you supposed to do with any of it, right? And there have been theories and philosophies and all kinds of ideas formulated about exactly what we do with it. And that's the stuff I ponder. What does it mean to be alive? And
So, philosopher in your own
to
right,
really
it needs to go in your title.
I was reading a blog post recently about, how philosophy is just the most tedious and exhausting of exercises, but so necessary because, man's a thinker, right? Or humankind, the thinking kind.
Mm-hmm.
And so the complicated thing is just, what is this life? What am I doing
Mm-hmm.
here? How do I make this, meaningful in a way that honors the essence of who I am and the essence of what humanity is,
Mm-hmm.
and that's easier said than done
Mm-hmm.
because there's so many ideas out there, so many influences that you have to figure out what works for you. And but then to do that with my whole being, and I think that's where the smell and taste and sound comes in because that is how you process the world. That is how you experience the world. Your body is the graphical user interface,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak, that you experience the world with, and your sight, your ability to perceive color and shape and touch, texture, all of that is how you make sense of it all. So I guess it was just a poetic and long-winded way to say that I
Yeah.
probably overthink all life, and I try to experience as much as I can,
Uh-huh.
as much as is available to me.
Well, I thought it was a
And
very,
it's
I loved the sentence. I thought it was a very engaging way of describing yourself. So, um, okay, so let's talk a little bit about Mythological Africans, the site that you are running, and the description online. I'm just going to read what it says. Says it's an online community for exploring mythology, folklore, spirituality, and culture from the African continent using a combination of storytelling, essays, live discussions, speaking engagement, and recorded lectures. Join us to delve into the rich diversity of oral traditions and worldviews from the African continent. and discover the intricate and textured African mythic imagination. So, was that your original description, or has it evolved over time?
It is the original description because I have not changed that since I set up the website, and I think it pretty much captures the essence of what I try to do with the platform. So yeah, I would say definitely the original.
And has your goals have your goals changed at all? I mean, did you start out with one goal and then has it evolved at all throughout time, or is it pretty much stayed the course?
I would say it has evolved, but it has been an evolution that is pretty much an emergence into what was naturally going to emerge, right? So it started as a Twitter page with tweets in the mythology and folklore community, and then as people asked questions or people made comments, it evolved into a YouTube channel because sometimes someone will make a comment or ask a question and I'll think I can't answer that in Twitter thread. There's just too many moving parts.
Yeah.
So videos, deep dives,
Uh-huh.
and then just a way to the newsletters, a way to keep people up to date with what was happening or what would be coming up. Because as I put myself more out there, got invited to give talks on specific topics. And then the Friday Twitter Space Storytime sessions was basically my effort to honor the storytelling tradition of African peoples because we didn't read books, right? We got together and told stories to each other. And so the story time sessions was just a way to say, okay, let's get together in person as much as that is possible and chat, read a story and talk about it the way it would have been done in communities in the past, which then emerged into the podcast because I started recording those sessions and they now are available as live podcasts, so to speak. So it has definitely evolved, excuse me, but it's been a natural evolution, I would say. Even the book was an outcome of all of that because as I explored stories and being a woman myself, I took specific interest in the stories of girls and women which came up and pondered about their lives. And that's essentially what the book is, an exploration of the lives of women and girls in African mythology and folklore.
And so when you were doing these Friday, what did you call it? The Friday storytelling?
Storytime
Storytime
sessions, yeah.
session. And people, so it would be a live session, and people would ask questions after you had read the story, and you would just have basic conversations with those commenters.
So we would pick a theme. So, for example, we would say, okay, today we are looking at folklore from the Kikuyu people in Kenya. I would read a story from the Kikuyu people and just talk about it. And what's great about these sessions is that usually you have someone say, "Oh, I know a version of that story from my part of the world." So it's always interesting to see those connections form. But then there was also, comments about the values that the stories revealed, or just what was fun about the stories. So the idea behind them is to just get a sense of who the people are through a story, what that story says about the people, but just about the world in general. And I like those sessions because one thing I've come to believe as I curate mythological Africans is that when you start looking at myths and folklore from around the world, the themes converge. It's the same battles, the same loss, the same betrayals, the same, you know, shared struggle to be alive. And I think that's a powerful thing, especially in the world we live in today where, for everything that you can find in common with another person, there are probably 10 that, would give you reason to say, I am different from this person, which is not to say differences do not exist and should not be honored, but, we can also stand to focus on the things that unite us, that make us, one human population. And I find that focusing on these stories, the myths and the folklore, really does do that.
Now, how do you do your research for these stories? Because if you're talking about, the all about the, the history and the culture about them, some of it is kind of difficult to find sometimes unless you're talking to, maybe someone who spoke it aloud as in the oral tradition. How are you researching these stories that you're talking about?
Um, so there are a lot of books out there, collections, mostly written by European, missionaries and anthropologists about the cultures that they were part of. And as you can imagine, these stories have the biases of these
Right.
people encoded in them. But there are also lots of research papers by Africans looking at these stories again, challenging assumptions, confirming statements that the missionaries made. So it's a process of I pick up a book, I look at what's in there, I run a Google Scholar search on a term to see what pops up. I take a look at that, and it really just varies. Sometimes I'll just read the story
Yeah.
for what it is and get impressions, and every now and then you'll have someone say, that's not quite what this means. I always think about this example where it was a story from Namibia, I believe,
Uh-huh.
and the story was a creature coded as a monster.
Mm-hmm.
And I shared, it wasn't in a Twitter space per se, it was a Twitter thread. And someone came back and said, that monster, even the name is referring to people with albinism. And that was quite a revelation for me because, in many cultures across the world, to be different, whether physically different or behaviorally different, perceptually different, you get coded type of way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has been known to happen. Or I'll read a story and someone will say, there's another version of the story which tells things differently. Or there is more to this story than meets the
Yeah.
eye. So those are always fun conversations to have because it just, like I said, the mythic and imagination of African people is amazing. And something that cracks me up when I think about it is that when these missionaries and ethnographers and anthropologists started publishing these books, with stories collected from the people they've been with, in some communities in Europe, there was, just disbelief. The idea that, these stories came from the people that were, believed to be inferior in every
Right.
way. People had a lot of struggle, reconciling the image that they had in their minds and the stories that were coming out. And so that continues to this day, and it's always a pleasure, to find a story that blows apart, some assumption that presents a new way of looking at the world. It's great, in the sessions when someone says, "Oh, I didn't know that," that makes me feel like, okay, so we're definitely accomplishing what we're aiming to accomplish here.
One of my daughters and my son, I have a 7-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter, and one of her absolute favorite books is Shadow, and it was a translated version into English from French. And I can't remember the name of the person who originally wrote it, but it's an African oral. It's basically taken from lots of different villages, and when you read it, it's just very powerful reading, and the illustrations are beautiful, and you can just tell that the story was meant to be said out loud in the oral tradition, and it's just really beautiful. And both my kids just asked for me to read that over and over again. And it's one of their favorite ones. I can't remember. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I don't know.
It
I do not.
won.
But and that's that thing because there are lots of beautifully illustrated collections of African stories out there, stories from different African peoples.
It won an award, like the Caldecott Medal in the '80s. But I'll put it on the website, and maybe you can look at it. It's beautiful. Okay. Let's see where. So, did you have a favorite story growing up as a kid in a storytelling household?
That's another really good question because there's this one story which I always talk about. It's the story of a woman named Mary Bonje, and it's one of those princess stories where she falls in love with a prince, and then there are machinations to separate them, and then she has to make him remember him. And I remember one of my cousins telling us the story, and I loved the story. But then as an adult, I remember the story clearly, but none of my siblings do, which I'm always like, how could you not remember Mary Bonje? So
Yeah.
that was one of my favorites. But we also had storytelling sessions where they were called John and Mary,
Uh-huh.
you know, but what I loved about these sessions is that you basically started with John and Mary, and then you could go in any direction. So it was kind of like a reflective exercise because John and Mary's story, whatever adventures they went on, would reflect whatever was going on in life at that time. So it was an opportunity to get creative.
Uh-huh.
And so John and Mary would go to school and have some adventure, or they would go into the neighborhood and have some adventure. Something was always happening. So those two definitely stood out. But then there are the regular stories that we would tell about the adventures of the tortoise, and the tortoise is one of the big trickster animals especially on the Western African coast,
Mm-hmm.
along with Spider and Nancy. But we had quite a few storytelling sessions, especially at school, because that would be part of the curriculum, the books that we would read. So, but I definitely remember Mary Bonje because it still drives me crazy as an adult that none of my siblings will remember. Will
Well,
remember.
maybe you can share those links so people can find those books if they're still available. That would be great. Do you know?
I don't. Well, Mary Bonja, I know there's not out there. Although I found a story in a collection of folk tales from Egypt and other northern African countries that is the closest I've ever
Mm,
seen to Bonja's story anywhere. But for the tortoise story, I think that was in our readers. These were books that we used at school.
uh-huh.
So I don't know that there would be a link to that
Oh,
out there anywhere.
okay.
But there are numerous collections out there that feature the tortoise, either from Yoruba folklore or Igbo folklore or some other African country. I know I have one PhD thesis, which is an analysis of folklore from the Bassa people in Cameroon, and it has stories and illustrations based on the adventures of the tortoise. So
Okay.
that probably, I suppose, I can get to a link, but there are bound to be the tortoise. You can't not find. Yeah,
The trickster tortoise.
yeah.
All right, so let's get into the story that we were going to talk about. The story of Asi. Is that how you pronounce it?
At least to my knowledge,
Okay.
I see.
So tell us the story. If you want to put on your storytelling hat and give us the story and talk to us a little bit about it.
The story of Asi is a story from the Foya Camara people in Sierra Leone, and by some account, she was a goddess herself. By some account, she was a seeress. But in every account, she was a woman who yearned for the color blue. And by some accounts, it's because the sky was so beautiful,
Mm.
and by some accounts, it's because the sky reflected in the water was a deep, deep blue that she could not have. By some accounts, it was a bird that flew by with plumage so vibrantly blue. It was something that she desired, and this desire was a dangerous thing, right? As it tends to be when you want
Mm.
something too much, the things you're willing to do to get it, can become your undoing. And in Massie's case, that's what happened because she wanted the color blue so much. She went to the waters and prepared to demand the color from the spirits, and came with a white cloth in which she had wrapped her baby.
Mm.
And in one account, she lays the baby down, puts some leaves to create a better cushion for the baby to lie on, and she lights a fire and you know, performs the ritual she needs to perform. And the gods, as they can be capricious sometimes, grants her wish. She got the color blue, but in exchange for that, she lost her baby.
Mm.
And the story, from what I understand, talks about how the indigo dyeing profession came to be in the hands of women because in in other parts of the continent on the West African coast, indigo dyeing was a profession that men did, women did. But in Sierra Leone, from what I understand, it's a tradition that is passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to mother to daughter. And so this is one of the stories that explain the inception of this tradition because after she was granted this wish, the spirit who granted her the wish told her, you can only share this secret with other women. And so that's how the indigo dyeing fabric came into that culture. And what's great about this story, what I love about it, is that it plays on the themes that show up in myths all around the world, right? If you're dealing with the gods, you have to be careful how you go about that because you never know what they're going to
You
ask
never
for in
know.
return. You never. And but what's great is that in one account of the story, she's able to have another baby, and the tradition lives on, and indigo dyeing and the patterns that emerged became a way that women could empower themselves, by trading, by expressing their creativity, and contributing something to the culture out of which they came. So I really like her story. It's a bit tragic.
Yeah.
You never want to see a situation where a baby ends up in a certain way. But for what it represents, I like it. I really do like it.
And so I read on that thread on your mythological Africans thread that indigo, there's the color indigo was really important. And why was that specific color why was it more important than other colors?
Well, I think mainly because the secret to its production, right? Like in many cultures you'll find around the world, it was privileged information, so it wasn't something that anybody could just get access to. And if you were a skilled dyer, for example, you could come up with patterns that royalty would want, for example. So and the trade that would happen, the more vibrant your colors, the more it stayed on the fabric, the more valuable your cloth was. And there were certain patterns that only specific people could wear, to indicate rank, or your participation in some community event, or your inclusion in some society. So it's one of those things where between just the privileged nature of how to do the dyeing and the skill of the dyer, and the trade opportunity it represented, and what different cloths meant to different people. It's a combination of those things, much like scarlet cloth in some cultures, or royal blue, as the name implies. So it was just one of those things that had so much coming in to make it different.
Do you know like how they make the color indigo? Because I imagine that several reds would come from berries, and I really don't know how you make the other colors, but I would imagine that blue would be one of the harder ones because I can only imagine. I would think that like maybe some flower petals. If you're thinking, I'm thinking natural dyes, right? Because for a long time it was
Right.
all natural. Do you know how it is made? Or
So the indigo color comes from two plants, from what I'm aware of. Um, it's in so amongst it has different names among different people. Amongst the Hausa people, for example, it's called Talaki, and amongst the Yoruba people, it's called Elu. And these are two peoples who indigo cloth features quite a bit in their cultures. But the scientific names is Indigofera, and Loncocarpus cyanescens, and I guess that cyanescence implies the blue color. And I think it's a combination. So the leaves are crushed. I think there's ash and salt water added. And if you refer back to Assie's story, the fire she lit, the leaves burned to make ash, and the salt from her tears added to the cloth. She held her baby and she was crying, and that's how. So there's a whole process which it's probably more complicated than I can go into, but it's a combination of the plant with ash and briny water, and from what I've read, the cloth. So depending on what pattern you want to emerge, it's kind of like tie dye when you really think about it. Like it's tie dyeing, so you fold the cloth a specific way, and you put the dye, and you dry it. And there are some clothes to which the dye will bind better than others, the dye binds better. And so yeah, but it's definitely a plant, so a leaf.
okay. And you talk about how the patterns and the cloths have different meanings. And in some of those articles, they talked about how somehow like proverbs were written into them and historical events. Can you talk a little bit about that?
For sure. So I don't doubt that there are those patterns that have meanings for the indigo dyeing patterns, but the proverbs and the stories have more to do with the kente cloth, which comes from the Ashanti and Ewe people in Ghana and Togo.
Mm-hmm.
And the kente cloth is another instantly recognizable fabric that comes out of the African
Mm-hmm.
continent. And it's the stripes and lines, colorful stripes and lines. And from what I understand, those different stripes and lines to a trained eye will represent, stories, usually associated with royalty, because that was one of the fabrics that was reserved for royalty. And the story, how that came to be, is one of the myths associated with it is that there were two hunters, in the forest, and they observed a spider building its web,
Mm-hmm.
and they decided to copy that and over time perfected the technique, which is great because if you look at Ashanti culture as well, Anansi, the spider is, a dominant trickster figure,
Mm-hmm.
trickster
Trickster.
figure. And another one of Anansi's stories that he is the one who succeeded in taking storytelling as a whole from the high god Nyame
Mm-hmm.
and bringing it to human beings. So yet another thing that this trickster figure brings to human beings is the ability to weave cloth, which when you think about it makes natural sense because spiders and weaving it goes together in pretty much all cultures that I can think about
Mm-hmm.
for obvious reasons. So, but it's with amongst the Ashanti people that the fabric tells a story. But then there are other types of cloth on the continent that will tell you a story about who's wearing it. The Ukara cloth, I believe, comes from the Igbo people, I believe, or southwestern, yeah, southeastern Nigerian
Mm-hmm.
people, and sometimes the cloth will be inscripted with symbols that speak to your position in society. Um, Membership in different groups that have varying importance in the community. So it's one of those things where, as in every other part of the world, how you present yourself to the public gives an indication of what position you hold and lets people know how you should be approached and how you should be treated.
And are women in charge of a lot of the fabric dyeing and designing in other countries, or does it change per country?
It definitely changes. It definitely
Mm-hmm.
changes. So, from what I have read and some of the pictures I've looked at, in Sierra Leone, for example, the dyeing is dominated by the women folk because it was a tradition passed down.
Mm-hmm.
And but then some of the pictures that I've seen of like the dyeing pits in different countries, there were men and young boys involved in the trade,
Mm-hmm.
and in cultures where cow hides were the main, clothing choice.
Mm-hmm.
The women tended not to be too involved in cattle rearing and all of that. So it would vary. I think the weaving, the dyeing, and all of that. It depended on the culture and what the people prioritize.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your book, and it's called The Runaway Princess and Other Stories, and it's a compilation of 20 stories. Is that right? And how did you come across these stories, or how did you decide that these were the stories that you wanted to highlight?
Um, Mainly by the stories that struck me. So as I would do research for different Twitter threads, talks, YouTube videos, every now and then I would run into a story of a woman which just I was blown away by her life and what happened. So I started keeping a mental tab because I figured this would be a great topic to delve into more deeply. And so I think the stories kind of chose themselves in many
Mm-hmm.
ways because I wanted stories that reflected the range of possibility for womanhood on the continent. So there are stories of elderly women, stories of young women, of children, but some of them are original stories, so not based on any folkloric retelling per se, but based on a particular culture.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, they are retellings of known stories out of the corpus of folklore that people have. So, but I really wanted to emphasize that there is no one way to be an African woman,
Mm-hmm.
and that comes out of a lot of discourse, which paints this ideal of this is how you have to be if you're a true African woman.
Mm-hmm.
This is how you have to think, this is how you have to behave. And what one thing I'm hoping, or one thing I hope I accomplished with that book was to actually, if you look at the old stories, stories that people have written over time, there is more than one way. They reflect the best and the worst parts of what being a woman on this planet, living this life can be. So, and this will get edited out. I hope my cat is eating and she makes so much noise. I hope that's not coming in because I can just hear her go.
So
Yeah, you gotta come over.
do you have a favorite? Is there any story in the Princess, the Runaway Princess, that highlights a mom that you could share a story of?
Ooh, a mom. Hmm. I'm trying to think. I mean, the very first story in the book is the story of Kunar,
Mm-hmm.
who was one of the stories that really struck me. And her story I retold significantly because her original story, the original folkloric version, comes out of a class of stories that you find in African folklore, but in folklore around the world. The strange pseudo story, where you have the girl who doesn't want to marry anyone from the village and then ends up with a stranger who turns out to be a monster. But her account in the culture out of which it's really funny how they tell it. It's still a cautionary tale, but I think the storyteller who shared the story with I think it was a German guy who connected the story was having too much fun with it because they dramatized it quite a bit. And she's still a monster in the story. She still gets killed. But I wanted to in the original story, she has a daughter who gets saved from her monstrous mother and all of that. And I wanted to present her in a different light as a woman who was just alive to her nature and didn't feel any shame about who she was and who just wanted the best for her daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one story of a mother who I really really like. But then there's also the story of Longo and her daughter Shemakoa, and this is a story that I base on the culture of the Ila people
Mm-hmm.
from Zambia, and it's just a story of a mother who is overwhelmed, with the things that life has thrown at her, and then her daughter ends up in a precarious position, and she has to figure out a way to get her daughter help. It's also the story of the healer who eventually helps them, and the healer is a transgender woman. So it brought a lot of things together for me. One, to highlight the fact that there are trans people in African
Mm-hmm.
culture, and in many cultures, they were healers and seers and people who were respected and loved.
Mm-hmm.
So the Longo's journey from just this overwhelmed woman who's overwhelmed was showing up as cruelty
Mm-hmm.
to a mother willing to do anything to help her child. I like that story as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just different stories of motherhood. There is another story in which is a young girl making sense of the world around her as she encounters different cultures and how they do womanhood and reconciling that with her own relationship with her
Mm-hmm.
mother. So that's one story as well. But like I said, different ways of being a woman, different ways of being a mother. There's another story of a woman who her well, the story is more about the woman's daughter than her, but in that story she's the mother who sees her daughter as just struggling, and she sits there with the struggle with her and tries to show up for her as compassionately as she can. And in the end, the story has a happy
Mm-hmm.
ending, thankfully. So there are different portraits of motherhood. There is a mother who passes on but still helps her daughter. there's a mother who is just so caught up in, her position as the king's wife, she's not able to see her daughter suffering.
Mm.
Um, you know, I'm trying to think. There's a story of a mother who, basically braved the wrath of the gods to save her daughter from dying. So different portraits of motherhood, and I think I am happy with how it turned out, because one of the ways in which women on the African continent get pigeonholed
Mhm.
is that there's this image of the mother. You have to be eternally patient, long suffering, bearing everything, unconditionally loving, which is not a bad thing.
Mhm.
But what that tends to do is, dehumanize women, put them in this position where if you're not fitting into this box, then you cannot be respected as a human
Right.
being. And it strips women of the multidimensionality that we have normally, as human beings. And so I'm very happy that the book portrays women in a variety of ways, as people with their own thoughts, people who had their own ideas of how they wanted to live, and people who were, victims to the circumstances of their communities,
Mhm.
and people who rose to the circumstances somehow.
Mhm. Yeah. And did you ever feel that way being a Cameroonian woman who moved to America, that you didn't fit within a specific stereotype that people wanted you to be in?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I right now I'm in my mid 30s. I'm 35. I don't have any
Mhm.
kids. I was in a committed partnership which ended. And by the standards of many people in my community, to be 35, not married, and not have children, it's kind of like, what are you doing with your life?
Yeah.
But, in many ways, I think this has just been a weird, well, I'm not call it weird, a quirk of my personality. Those were not things that I put too much stock
Mhm.
in. Like you said, sitting in nature, pondering complicated things, trying to think about life has always been more my jam. But then I wouldn't say it has pigeonholed unlimitedly, because I just never held myself to those standards. So I'll think about it every now and then. But the pondering has always been more, wow, I'm so glad I didn't hold myself to those
Mhm.
standards, because I would be miserable right now if I did. So I would say not really,
Yeah.
not not really. Yeah.
Is there a story in your book that people are the most surprised about in a different archetype of a woman? I know you mentioned that there was a transgender. Did you say she was a healer? A transgender healer. I would imagine that would be pretty shocking for certain people with an idea of what an African woman was like. Is there another shocking archetype that people are not expecting?
Igoro is an elderly woman who is determined to fight. And her story is hilarious. I told her story as a poem. But I remember reading that story and thinking, wow, this is different. So she's an old woman who, for reasons known only to Igoro, is determined to fight. And she uses every means available to her to get people to fight her. And everybody's like, why do you want to fight, old lady? What's your problem? You don't
Like she wants to
understand.
physically
Because
fight, like have a
physically fight, just fight, all out
yeah.
war. And in the end, she's taken up by a trickster figure, because trickster figures are the ones who do the forbidden. Because in African cultures and in most cultures, you don't fight an elderly person.
Mhm.
Why would you do that? So Terry, the trickster figure, takes her up on her offer and beats her up. Beats her up, which is, you shouldn't do that. And he learns, pretty pretty quickly why you don't fight an elderly person, because it turns out Igoro was not just an elderly woman. She taught him a few things. Let's put it that way.
Ah,
So, but that's another story. I think might raise a few eyebrows.
yeah, that's
But
interesting.
And then there's the titular character, Yenenga, who is another woman who turns the stereotypes of who a woman should be on the head.
Uh-huh.
Because in her story, she is a princess, daughter of a powerful king, but also a brilliant warrior. so good at being a warrior, in fact, that her father refuses to let her marry because when she married, she would not be able to fight his
Yeah.
wars. And in some accounts of her story, locks her up, to prevent her from doing anything other than what he wanted her to
Oh.
do. And with the help of some soldiers in her under her command, she escapes and meets a hunter in the forest, and they marry and they have a child who is an ancestor of the Mosi people in Burkina Faso. And I love Yenenga's story because it's one of those like, wait, hold on, because if you look at most African cultures, you are supposed to marry as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to have children. That's what is expected of you.
Mm-hmm.
So to have a story where that was just the reverse, that made me quite happy.
Mm.
And one thing I wanted to do in the story was explore the mindset, what was going on in people's minds, what were they thinking, what were their motivations, and digging into that was fun.
Mm.
So I went through a couple of stories which might raise a few eyebrows.
How did you dig into their mindset? Did you just kind of think about it on your own, or did you do any interviews with people to kind of learn about what their thoughts were? How did you decide what their mindsets
A lot
were?
of a lot of that process was shaped by the deadlines I gave myself because the book was funded by a Kickstarter campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And to honor the spirit of it. And now that I think about it, that's something I will probably never ever do again. I wanted to deliver as fast as possible. So the stories were mainly involved by the original folkloric account, but some readings that I did around the cultures of the people so that I could probably better understand motivations. So, for example, Yenenga's story, I did some reading on the Dagomba people because that's the culture out of which her story comes. A little bit of reading on the Mosi people to understand how they feel about this ancestral figure, and just generally trying to understand the cultural context out of which the story came. And that's how I understood just what motherhood means to the Dagomba people and why that account is so revolutionary because by what I read, that is a woman's greatest purpose in life to be a mother. So to have a situation where this man just didn't want her to marry and have children, that was striking indeed. And then there's a story of Takane, which comes from the Sotho people, and in her story, she literally goes out and kills a dragon to give her brother something that he needed, and the story is just a straight account of that. So I had to put some flesh around it, build it up into a fuller, entity. So getting an understanding of inheritance patterns amongst the people out of the story, which the story came, and just ferreting out bits of information that would make things more concrete.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's usually how I got the information. Something I would definitely do differently in future projects would be to try to talk to people within the culture, which is kind of difficult to do, seeing as I'm in
Right.
the US. And, this was all the African continent. But try to have more conversations, give myself more time to have these conversations, and kind of see what people think. But then that's the fun thing about being a writer, right? A storyteller. You have that creative license to shape things differently. It's not a documentary. It's not a history book that I'm writing where I have to represent facts accurately. It's a work of fiction.
Yeah.
It's an exploration of the imagination. So it swings back and forth, but it was mostly informed by books, by research papers, and the like. Yeah.
Do you think that you'll do another project similar? Do you have anything in mind for another book that you want to write?
I am open to a volume two, so looking at a different set of women and exploring the circumstances around their stories. I would absolutely love to do that. But another thing that I hope I get the chance to work on is looking at children specifically in African folklore, and the stories around children, especially since there is a category of heroic children in African traditions, where they're different. Let's just call it that. They're child heroes,
Mhm.
but they come with a lot of complications around them, and there are instances of such children in stories from almost all across the continent. So that would be an interesting project to
Yeah,
look at. But definitely stories of more women from the continent.
absolutely. Well, is there anything else that we missed that you feel like we need to talk about? I mean, this has been such a fantastic conversation, and I feel like we could keep going, but obviously we can't just talk all day. But is there anything that we've missed that you would like to talk about?
I think we've been pretty thorough so far. It's you are right. Mythology and folklore is something where you could literally almost always find a tangent to go on and
Right.
open up a new with new stories and different ideas to explore. But if you would like more mythology and folklore from the African continent, you can subscribe to the Mythological Africans newsletter. It's the best way to keep track of what else is going on.
How
I've
frequently does your
been
newsletter
away.
come out?
It's a monthly
Okay.
newsletter, so it goes out every, and it usually will give a roundup of things that happened the previous month and a preview of what is to
Mm.
come. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel because every month as well I do an episode for the deep dive series. And recently we've been exploring sexuality on the African
Mm.
continent. So we've had an episode doing an overview of just what African people thought and did around sexuality. We've had an episode on intersex people on the African continent. We've had an episode on heterosexual
Mm.
practices. Um, More recently, we've had an episode on gay men, and the most recent episode is on lesbian women. And the idea is really to contribute to the human right issue, because it's easy to frame sexuality as this choice that people make,
Mm-hmm.
but the way I've always thought about it is, given the human instinct for self-preservation, who would choose something that basically literally puts their life at risk?
Right.
And so in these episodes, pulling from culture, from folklore, from mythology when relevant, to say, hey, we have been here. People who are queer have been on the African continent. This is not something that colonialism or globalization brought. And these are the stories
Mm-hmm.
around this. But yeah, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel as well, and of course the podcast, which we've talked about briefly. These are recordings of past conversations
Mm-hmm.
that held spaces, so you almost always get a story and a discussion around the story. And yeah, I think those are the main reasons. Before the Twitter account as well, I've not been as active as I normally am on Twitter recently for the last month, because I've had what I needed to focus on, and needed to not be online so much, because it can get a bit too much. So you can go to the Twitter page. There's a lot of information on Twitter. So through the hashtags that involve your Facebook community online, we do research Monday, Friday, Tuesday, Weird Wednesday, Temple Thursday, and Folklore Thursday. We have Question Friday, Superstition Saturday, and Folklore Sunday. So if you search each of those tags and add music Africans, you pull up different threads that I have done, different topics. And yeah, you have to keep up with all that activity, you're more than
Well, that sounds fantastic. That's a lot to keep up with.
why I need the break.
Yeah.
Let's just say it's
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure.
it's been a pleasure to be here talking with you as well. Um,
And thank you, Folkological folks, for joining us on this African mythological journey. All links that we have talked about, that we have links to, will be on our website, which is www.fabricoffolklore.com. And as always, we want to hear from you. So we have a Facebook page. It's called Fabric of Folklore Community, and that is the place where you can tell us all about what you enjoyed about this show. What was your favorite story that you heard about? What is your favorite African mythological story or folktale. We want to hear from you, and we want to hear about who you want to hear from. So definitely find us on Facebook, and that is the page for y'all to have a conversation. And so if you are enjoying the show, one of the best ways that you can help to support us is to rate and review us. So we are on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify. Give us all the stars and give us a review, because that helps other people to find us on their own. And you can comment, like, and share our YouTube channel, our YouTube videos, and also just audio versions as well are on Spotify and the other podcasting platforms. So if you are looking for different ways to share, you can have a shirt embroidered with fabric of folklore and pass it out all to all your friends. Or you could just tell your mom about it. Whichever one is easiest and what works best for you. Once again, I'm Vanessa Y. Rogers, the host of Fabric of Folklore. Thanks for joining us and while we unravel the mysteries of folklore. And until next week, keep the folk alive.